The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast their familiar harsh glow across the linoleum floors as Rebecca Martinez finished her final rounds on the night shift. It was March 15th, 1994, and the 32-year-old registered nurse had been working in the cardiac intensive care unit for 8 years. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floor as she checked on Mrs. Henderson in room 304 one last time, adjusting the elderly woman's blanket with the gentle care that had made her beloved among patients and colleagues alike. Rebecca's dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, a few strands escaping after the long 12-hour shift. She glanced at her watch. 7:47 a.m. Her replacement, Jennifer, would arrive any minute, and Rebecca could finally head home to her small apartment in Queens. She had plans to sleep until noon, then meet her sister Maria for lunch at their favorite diner on Northern Boulevard. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now, let's continue with Rebecca's story. The morning sun was just beginning to filter through the hospital windows as Rebecca gathered her purse from the staff lounge. She waved goodbye to Dr. Peterson, who was reviewing charts at the nurses' station, and pushed through the heavy glass doors that led to the parking garage. The March air in New York was still crisp, carrying the promise of spring, but with winter's stubborn chill clinging to the concrete and steel of the city. Rebecca's 1989 Honda Civic sat in its usual spot on the third level of the parking structure. She had bought the car used 2 years earlier, and despite its faded blue paint and a temperamental radio, it had never failed to get her to and from work. As she walked toward her car, her footsteps echoed in the nearly empty garage. Most of the day shift staff wouldn't arrive for another hour, leaving the structure feeling hollow and abandoned. She unlocked her car door and slid into the driver's seat, placing her purse on the passenger side. The engine turned over with its familiar rough idle, and she adjusted her rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her tired eyes. The night shift was taking its toll, but the extra pay helped her send money home to her mother in Puerto Rico and still save for the nursing master's program she hoped to start in the fall. As Rebecca pulled out of the parking garage, she didn't notice the dark sedan that had been parked 2 levels down, its driver watching her every movement through the concrete pillars. The car followed at a distance as she merged onto the Long Island Expressway, maintaining just enough space to remain undetected in the early morning traffic. The drive to Queens usually took Rebecca about 25 minutes, depending on traffic. She had made this journey countless times, often listening to the morning news on 1010 Wins, or sometimes just enjoying the quiet after a long night of beeping monitors and urgent calls. This morning, she tuned to a soft rock station, humming along to an old Eagles song as she navigated the familiar route. But Rebecca Martinez would never make it home that morning. Somewhere between the hospital parking garage and her apartment building, she simply vanished, leaving behind only her abandoned car on a side street in Astoria, the keys still in the ignition and her purse untouched on the passenger seat. The first person to notice something was wrong was Maria Santos, Rebecca's younger sister by 3 years. When Rebecca failed to show up for their lunch date at Dimitri's diner, Maria initially assumed her sister had simply overslept after her night shift. It wouldn't have been the first time, but when Maria called Rebecca's apartment and got no answer, a knot of worry began to form in her stomach. Maria had a key to Rebecca's apartment. They had always been close, especially since their father's death 5 years earlier. She drove to the small one-bedroom unit on 31st Avenue, calling Rebecca's name as she unlocked the front door. The apartment was exactly as Rebecca had left it the previous evening. Bed made, breakfast dishes clean and put away, uniform for the next shift hanging in the closet. "Becca?" Maria called out, checking the bathroom and the small kitchen. The silence felt oppressive, heavy with an absence that seemed to press against Maria's chest. She noticed Rebecca's favorite coffee mug was still in the dish rack, and her reading glasses, the ones she needed for charting, were on the nightstand next to a half-finished romance novel. By 6 o'clock that evening, when Rebecca still hadn't returned or called, Maria contacted the police. Officer Danny Chen of the 114th Precinct took the missing person report, his expression growing more serious as Maria described her sister's reliable nature and consistent routines. "Your sister ever disappear before? Maybe go somewhere without telling anyone?" Chen asked, his pen poised over the report form. "Never," Maria said firmly. "Rebecca calls if she's going to be even 15 minutes late. She's the most responsible person I know. Something's happened to her." The investigation began immediately. Though in 1994 the resources available to police were limited compared to today's standards, Detective Sarah Walsh was assigned to the case, a seasoned investigator who had worked missing persons cases for over a decade. She understood that the first 48 hours were crucial, and Rebecca Martinez had already been missing for nearly 12. Walsh's first stop was St. Mary's Hospital, where she interviewed Rebecca's colleagues and supervisors. Everyone painted the same picture. Rebecca was dependable, well-liked, and showed no signs of distress or unusual behavior during her final shift. Dr. Peterson remembered seeing her leave at the usual time, and Jennifer Morrison, the nurse who was supposed to relieve her, confirmed that Rebecca had completed all her duties before departing. "She seemed normal," Morrison told Detective Walsh. "Maybe a little tired, but that's typical after a night shift. She mentioned looking forward to lunch with her sister and maybe catching a movie later." The hospital's security cameras from 1994 were rudimentary compared to modern systems, and the tape quality was poor. Walsh could make out a figure leaving the hospital at approximately 7:50 a.m., but the images were too grainy to provide any useful details about what might have happened next. Meanwhile, Rebecca's Honda Civic had been discovered by a traffic enforcement officer on a quiet residential street in Astoria, about 5 miles from her apartment. The car was unlocked, keys in the ignition, with Rebecca's purse containing her wallet, credit cards, and $127 in cash, sitting undisturbed on the passenger seat. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of foul play. Just an abandoned car that seemed to be waiting for its owner to return. Detective Walsh had the car towed and processed for evidence. The fingerprint analysis revealed only Rebecca's prints and those of family members and close friends who had occasionally borrowed the vehicle. The forensics team found no foreign DNA, no fibers that didn't belong, no indication that anyone else had been in the car recently. As days turned into weeks, the investigation expanded. Walsh interviewed Rebecca's neighbors, her friends from nursing school, even her ex-boyfriend from 2 years earlier. Everyone described the same person, a dedicated nurse who loved her work, was close to her family, and had no enemies or dangerous associations. The search for Rebecca Martinez consumed Maria's life. She took time off from her job at a Brooklyn elementary school to distribute flyers throughout Queens and Manhattan. Rebecca's photograph, a professional headshot from her nursing school graduation, soon appeared on telephone poles, in subway stations, and in the windows of local businesses. The image showed a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, someone who looked like she would stop to help a stranger find their way. The case received modest media attention in the New York area. The New York Post ran a small article on page 6, and a local television news station did a brief segment during their evening broadcast. But in a city where people disappeared regularly, Rebecca Martinez's story was soon overshadowed by other crimes, other tragedies, other mysteries that demanded the public's attention. As 1994 turned into 1995, then 1996, the active investigation inevitably slowed. Detective Walsh continued to follow up on leads as they came in, but they were becoming increasingly rare and less promising. Maria never stopped hoping, never stopped searching. But the weight of uncertainty began to take its toll on the entire Santos family. Rebecca's mother, Carmen, flew up from Puerto Rico for the first anniversary of her daughter's disappearance. The family held a small memorial service at St. Sebastian's Church in Woodside, where Rebecca had been baptized and confirmed. Father Rodriguez, who had known the family for years, spoke about hope and faith during the most difficult times, but even his words felt hollow against the enormity of their loss. Years passed. Maria married her longtime boyfriend, had 2 children, but never moved far from Queens, always hoping that somehow, someday, Rebecca would find her way home. The missing person case remained officially open, but with no new evidence or leads, it essentially went cold. Detective Walsh retired in 2001, passing the file to her successor with a heavy heart and instructions to call her if anything new ever surfaced. The world changed dramatically in the decades that followed. Cell phones became ubiquitous, security cameras multiplied throughout the city, and social media connected people in ways that were unimaginable in 1994. But for Maria Santos and her family, time seemed frozen on that March morning when Rebecca Martinez walked out of St. Mary's Hospital and vanished into the bustling anonymity of New York City. By 2023, Maria had become a grandmother, her hair showing streaks of silver that reminded her painfully of how Rebecca would have looked if she had lived to see 59. The family had moved to a larger house in Nassau County, but Maria kept Rebecca's bedroom exactly as it had been, a shrine to a life interrupted. Every year on March 15th, she would visit the spot where Rebecca's car had been found, leaving flowers and saying a prayer for her sister's soul. The case file had been digitized and transferred between departments multiple times over the years. Occasionally, a new detective would review it, hoping to find something that previous investigators had missed. But the evidence remained frustratingly thin. A reliable woman who simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve with time. Then, on a humid Tuesday morning in August 2023, everything changed with a single phone call to the NYPD's cold case unit. The caller was Dr. Amanda Foster, a physician at Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan, and her voice carried an urgency that immediately caught Detective Michael Rodriguez's attention. "I think one of my patients may have seen Rebecca Martinez," Dr. Foster said, referring to a case file that had been gathering digital dust for nearly 3 decades. "The woman who disappeared from St. Mary's Hospital in 1994. My patient is elderly, has some dementia, but she's been very insistent about this. She claims she saw her just last week." Detective Rodriguez, who had only recently been assigned to cold cases, pulled up the Martinez file on his computer screen. The photograph of the missing nurse stared back at him, a young woman frozen in time, never aging beyond 32. He had read through the case summary several times, struck by how thoroughly the woman had simply vanished. "What exactly did your patient tell you?" Rodriguez asked, reaching for a notepad. Dr. Foster explained that Eleanor Hutchinson, an 87-year-old woman being treated for a heart condition, had become increasingly agitated during her hospital stay. She kept insisting that one of the nurses was someone she had known years ago, someone who had disappeared. When pressed for details, Eleanor had provided specific information about Rebecca Martinez that wasn't widely known to the public. She described a small scar on the nurse's left hand, shaped like a crescent moon, Dr. Foster continued. She also mentioned that the woman spoke Spanish to Hispanic patients and had a very distinctive laugh. "These details aren't in any of the news reports I could find online." Rodriguez felt the familiar tingle of excitement that came with a potential breakthrough. He had worked enough cold cases to know that most leads led nowhere. But something about Eleanor Hutchinson's specificity intrigued him. He arranged to interview the elderly woman that afternoon, hoping that her memories might finally shed light on a mystery that had haunted the Martinez family for 29 years. Mount Sinai Hospital bustled with the controlled chaos, typical of a major medical center. Detective Rodriguez found Eleanor Hutchinson in room 712, a private room with a view of Central Park. Despite her age and medical condition, her eyes were alert and focused when he introduced himself. "You're here about Rebecca," Eleanor said before Rodriguez could explain his visit. "I knew someone would finally listen. She's working here, you know, night shift cardiac unit, just like she did at the other hospital." Rodriguez sat down beside her bed, his notepad ready. "Mrs. Hutchinson, can you tell me exactly what you saw?" Eleanor's account was remarkably detailed. She described a nurse who appeared to be in her late 50s or early 60s, with graying dark hair and kind eyes that seemed familiar. The woman had been particularly gentle when adjusting Eleanor's IV line, speaking softly in both English and Spanish to comfort her Hispanic roommate. "She had that same scar on her hand," Eleanor insisted, "shaped like a little moon. And when she laughed at something, another nurse said, I knew immediately. It was Rebecca Martinez. I'd seen her picture in the newspapers years ago when she went missing." Rodriguez listened carefully, taking notes, but also studying Eleanor's demeanor. Despite her age, she seemed lucid and certain about what she had witnessed. He asked her about the timing, the specific nurse's appearance, and any other details she could remember. "She called me sweetheart when she checked on me during the night," Eleanor continued. "That's what Rebecca used to call her patients at St. Mary's. My late husband was treated there in the early 90s, before she disappeared. She took such good care of him." The detective's pulse quickened. This was information that hadn't been in any of the public reports about Rebecca Martinez. He would need to verify Eleanor's claim about her husband being treated at St. Mary's, but if true, it would explain how she knew such specific details about the missing nurse. After completing his interview with Eleanor, Rodriguez sought out Dr. Foster and the nursing staff on the cardiac unit. He showed them the 1994 photograph of Rebecca Martinez, now enhanced and age-progressed by police technology, to show how she might look at 61 years old. Nurse Patricia Williams, who had been working the night shift when Eleanor made her claims, examined the photos carefully. "There is someone new on our unit," she admitted. "Started about 3 weeks ago, goes by the name Rosa Delgado. She's in her early 60s, very experienced, great with patients, but now that you mention it, there is something familiar about her." Rodriguez asked to see Rosa Delgado's employment file, but hit his first roadblock. According to hospital administration, while they could confirm that someone by that name was employed in their cardiac unit, they couldn't provide personal information without a warrant. However, they did agree to arrange a meeting, ostensibly for a routine follow-up about a patient inquiry. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening during Rosa Delgado's shift. Rodriguez arrived at the hospital with his partner, Detective Lisa Chen, both of them carrying copies of the age-progressed photographs and the original 1994 missing person report. They waited in a small conference room near the cardiac unit, the fluorescent lighting eerily similar to what Rebecca Martinez would have worked under 3 decades earlier. When Rosa Delgado entered the room, both detectives immediately noticed the resemblance to the age-progressed images. She was approximately the right height and build, with graying dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, reminiscent of how Rebecca had worn hers. But it was her hands that caught Rodriguez's attention. Specifically, the small crescent-shaped scar on her left hand that Eleanor Hutchinson had described. "Ms. Delgado," Rodriguez began carefully, "we're investigating a cold case from 1994, and we believe you might have some information that could help us." Rosa's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face went pale, and her hands began to tremble slightly. She sat down heavily in one of the conference room chairs, her eyes darting between the two detectives. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Detective Chen leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "We have a witness who believes she recognized you as Rebecca Martinez, a nurse who disappeared from St. Mary's Hospital in Queens on March 15, 1994. Can you tell us where you were living in 1994? The woman, who called herself Rosa Delgado, was silent for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming down her face. "My name," she whispered, "is Rebecca Martinez, and I've been hiding for 29 years. The confession that followed would unravel one of New York City's most puzzling missing person cases and reveal a story of survival, desperation, and the lengths one woman would go to protect herself from a danger that had never truly disappeared. Rebecca, for it was indeed her, began her story with the morning she vanished. She had left St. Mary's Hospital as usual, but as she drove through Queens toward her apartment, she noticed a car following her. At first, she thought it was coincidence, but when the vehicle made the same series of turns she did, fear began to creep into her mind. "I had been getting strange phone calls for about 2 weeks before I disappeared," Rebecca explained to the detectives. "Heavy breathing, then hanging up, sometimes a man's voice saying my name, then the line would go dead. I thought it was just a prank, maybe someone from the hospital playing a joke. But the calls had escalated. The voice began saying things that made Rebecca realize the caller knew her schedule, knew when she worked, knew details about her daily routine that only someone watching her could know. She had mentioned it to her supervisor at the hospital, who suggested she report it to the police, but Rebecca had hesitated, not wanting to seem paranoid or dramatic. The morning of March 15, 1994, when Rebecca saw the car following her, all those fears crystallized into terror. Instead of driving home, she made a series of random turns, trying to lose the vehicle. When that didn't work, she pulled into a gas station and sat in her car, watching as the dark sedan parked across the street. "I could see him," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The driver. He was watching me through binoculars. That's when I knew I was in real danger." Rebecca had made a split-second decision that would define the next 3 decades of her life. She abandoned her car at the gas station, taking only her purse, and slipped out the back exit while the man in the sedan was still watching the front. She caught a city bus to Manhattan, then another to Brooklyn, moving randomly through the city as she tried to figure out what to do. "I was so scared," she continued. "I didn't know who this person was or what he wanted, but I knew he had been watching me, learning my habits. I was afraid that if I went home, he would be waiting for me. If I went to Maria's house, I might put her in danger too." For the first few days, Rebecca stayed in cheap motels, paying cash and using false names. She called in sick to the hospital, then realized that her stalker might be monitoring her workplace as well. The weight of her situation began to sink in. She couldn't go home, couldn't contact her family, couldn't return to her normal life without potentially putting herself and others at risk. "I went to the police," Rebecca said, anticipating the detective's next question. "I went to a precinct in Manhattan, told them about the stalking, about being followed, but I couldn't prove anything. The officer took a report, but he made it clear that without concrete evidence or threats, there wasn't much they could do." Rebecca had left the police station feeling more alone and vulnerable than ever. She realized that her stalker, whoever he was, had been careful not to leave evidence. The phone calls were untraceable, and she had no proof that the car following her wasn't just coincidence. In the eyes of the law, she was simply a paranoid woman with no concrete case. Detective Rodriguez interrupted her narrative. Rebecca, your family has been searching for you for 29 years. Your sister Maria never gave up hope. Why didn't you contact them once you felt safe?" This question seemed to cause Rebecca the most pain. Fresh tears began to flow as she struggled to explain the impossible choice she had made. "At first, I thought it would just be for a few weeks," she said. "I thought the stalker would give up, move on to someone else, and I could go home. But after a month, then 2 months, I realized that coming back would be dangerous. What if he was still watching? What if my reappearance put Maria and my mother at risk?" Rebecca had created a new identity using forged documents she obtained through connections in New York's underground economy. She dyed her hair, changed her appearance, and moved to Philadelphia, where she worked as a nurse's aide under the name Rosa Delgado. She chose the name carefully, Rosa after her grandmother Delgado, because it was common enough to blend in, but different enough from Martinez to avoid accidental connections. "Every day for 29 years, I thought about calling Maria," Rebecca said. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every anniversary of the day I disappeared. I would pick up the phone and start to dial, then stop. I convinced myself that they were better off thinking I was dead than living in fear that the stalker might come back." The years had passed slowly. Rebecca built a new life in Philadelphia, eventually becoming a registered nurse again through careful manipulation of her credentials and references. She never married, never had children, never formed relationships that went too deep, always afraid that someone might discover her true identity. "I followed the news about my case online," she admitted. "I read every article, watched every news segment. I saw Maria aging in photographs, saw her get married, have children. I watched my nieces and nephews grow up through newspaper stories and social media posts that I could never comment on or like because I didn't exist." In 2020, Rebecca had made the decision to move back to the New York area. Her stalker, if he was still alive, would be in his 70s or 80s by now. The world had changed dramatically, and she hoped that enough time had passed for her to quietly return to the region where she belonged. "I got the job at Mount Sinai using my Rosa Delgado identity," she explained. "I thought I could work here, maybe even see Maria from a distance sometimes without disrupting the life she had built. I never expected a patient to recognize me." Detective Chen asked about Eleanor Hutchinson, and Rebecca's face showed a mixture of sadness and resignation. "Mrs. Hutchinson's husband was one of my patients at St. Mary's in 1993, Rebecca confirmed. "He was there for several weeks with heart problems. She visited him every day, and we became friendly. She has an amazing memory, even with her dementia. I should have realized she might recognize me, even after all these years." The detectives had many more questions, but it was clear that Rebecca was emotionally exhausted. They arranged for her to remain at the hospital overnight, under protective custody, while they verified her story and decided how to proceed. The revelation that Rebecca Martinez was alive would need to be handled carefully, both for her safety and for the family that had mourned her for nearly 3 decades. Detective Rodriguez spent the rest of the night reviewing the original case files and cross-referencing Rebecca's account with the evidence that had been gathered in 1994. Her story explained many of the puzzling aspects of her disappearance: why her car was found undisturbed, why there were no signs of struggle, why she seemed to have simply vanished into thin air. The next morning, Rodriguez faced the delicate task of contacting Maria Santos, now Maria Gonzalez, to inform her that her sister was alive. He decided to visit her in person, understanding that such life-changing news needed to be delivered with care and compassion. Maria was tending to her garden behind her Nassau County home when Detective Rodriguez arrived. At 58, she bore a strong resemblance to what Rebecca might have looked like if she had aged naturally in the comfort of her family's love. When Rodriguez introduced himself and mentioned the Rebecca Martinez case, Maria's face immediately tensed with a mixture of hope and fear she had carried for 29 years. "Have you found her?" Maria asked, her voice barely steady. "Mrs. Gonzalez," Rodriguez said gently, "your sister is alive. She's been hiding for 29 years, but she's safe, and she wants to see you." The reunion between Rebecca and Maria took place the following day at Mount Sinai Hospital, with Detective Rodriguez and a victim's advocate present to provide support. Nearly 3 decades of separation, grief, and desperate hope culminated in an embrace that seemed to bridge all the lost years in a single moment. Both women cried openly as they held each other, Maria repeatedly saying, "I knew you were alive, I always knew," while Rebecca whispered apologies for all the pain her disappearance had caused. The years fell away as they talked, sharing stories of their lives, catching up on marriages, children, deaths, and all the milestones that had passed in silence. Rebecca met her nephews and nieces, now adults with children of their own, and was welcomed into a family that had never stopped loving her despite her absence. Maria's husband, Carlos, embraced his sister-in-law with tears in his eyes, telling her that Maria had talked about her every day for 29 years. The hardest part was explaining to Rebecca that their mother, Carmen, had died in 2018, still hoping to see her daughter again. Rebecca wept for the reunion that would never happen, for the years of phone calls she could have made, for the choice that had seemed so necessary at the time, but now felt like a tragic waste. As for the stalker who had driven Rebecca into hiding, that mystery remained unsolved. With nearly 30 years having passed, and with Rebecca unable to provide a clear identification of her pursuer, the chances of ever finding him were minimal. Detective Rodriguez theorized that the man might have been a patient or visitor at St. Mary's Hospital who had become obsessed with Rebecca, but without more concrete evidence, it would remain speculation. The story of Rebecca Martinez's return made national news, capturing public attention as a rare example of a missing person case with a happy ending. Media outlets struggled to balance the family's joy at being reunited with questions about whether Rebecca could have handled the situation differently, whether she could have trusted law enforcement to protect her, whether the 29 years of separation had been necessary. For Rebecca, adjusting to her returned life proved challenging. She struggled with guilt over the pain her disappearance had caused, with regret over the time she had lost, and with the practical difficulties of resuming a legal identity she had abandoned decades earlier. She underwent counseling to help process the trauma of both the original stalking and the years of self-imposed exile. The legal aspects of her return were complex. Rebecca Martinez had been declared legally dead in 2001, 7 years after her disappearance. Reversing that declaration required extensive paperwork and legal proceedings. Her social security number had been retired, her nursing license had expired, and she had no official existence in the records of American society. With the help of attorneys specializing in unusual cases, Rebecca began the process of reclaiming her legal identity. She testified in court about her reasons for disappearing, with Detective Rodriguez and other officials supporting her account. The judge, moved by the extraordinary circumstances, approved the necessary documentation to restore Rebecca Martinez to legal existence. Rebecca chose to retire from nursing, finding it too difficult to work under the intense media scrutiny that followed her story. Instead, she focused on rebuilding relationships with her family and contributing to missing person advocacy groups. She became a spokesperson for stalking victims, encouraging people in similar situations to seek help rather than disappearing as she had done. The house in Queens, where Rebecca had lived in 1994, had long since been sold, but Maria helped her find a small apartment nearby, close enough for daily visits, but far enough to give Rebecca the space she needed to readjust to a life she had abandoned 3 decades earlier. The apartment was modest, furnished with simple pieces that reflected Rebecca's desire for a quiet, uncomplicated existence. 1 year after her return, Rebecca visited the spot where her car had been found abandoned in 1994. The neighborhood had changed significantly. New construction, different businesses, families who had moved in and out over the decades. But standing there, she could still remember the terror she had felt that morning, the desperation that had driven her to make such a drastic choice. "I don't regret protecting myself," she told Maria as they stood together on the quiet street. "But I regret the cost. I regret all the time we lost, all the moments we can never get back." Maria squeezed her sister's hand. "You're here now," she said simply. "That's what matters." Rebecca Martinez had been given something rare in missing person cases, a second chance at life, at family, at belonging somewhere. At 61, she was learning to navigate a world that had changed dramatically during her absence, to use technology she had never encountered, to form relationships without the constant fear of discovery that had defined her existence as Rosa Delgado. The case officially closed when Detective Rodriguez filed his final report, marking the Rebecca Martinez disappearance as solved with the victim found alive. Eleanor Hutchinson, the elderly patient whose recognition had triggered the reunion, died peacefully 3 months later, satisfied that she had helped solve a mystery that had troubled her for years. Rebecca kept Eleanor's hospital bracelet as a reminder that sometimes the most important connections in life come from unexpected sources. An elderly woman with failing memory had somehow reached across decades to bring a lost daughter home, proving that love and recognition can transcend time, age, and even the most carefully constructed disappearances. As Rebecca Martinez settled into her reclaimed life, she often thought about the butterfly effect, how one moment of terror in 1994 had rippled through 29 years, affecting not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who loved her. She had survived, had protected herself, had built a new existence from nothing, but she had also learned that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in running away, but in trusting others to help you face whatever threatens to destroy the life you were meant to live. The story of the nurse who vanished after her shift in 1994 had finally reached its conclusion, not with tragedy or mysterious circumstances, but with the powerful reminder that families never stop hoping, that love transcends time, and that it's never too late to come home.